Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Elements of Historical Theory, Part 3. So the first one I want to discuss in this particular lecture is what's known as the political spectrum. Now, when I talk about this, keep in mind that the positions on the political spectrum are associated with attitudes towards change, not ideology, as is most commonly understood in modern parlance, if you will. To the historian, we are talking specifically about attitudes towards change. Now, there are 5 positions along this political spectrum. The first is the radical. That's the far left position. They want change now. Consequences be damned. Immediate change, no matter what. Just slightly to the right of that is the liberal position. And when I say liberal, I mean with the little l, not to be confused with the capital L liberal, which implies a specific modern political ideology. Now, along the historical political spectrum, liberals advocate for fast change, but with some accounting for the consequences involved. But nevertheless, they advocate for a speedy rate of change. Then there is the middle or moderate position, in between the right and the left, which is a balance between that liberal and conservative position, and folks along this particular point can be swayed either way depending on the power of the arguments from either side. Then, slightly to the right of the moderate position is the conservative position. And like the liberal position that I just spoke about, I'm talking about conservative with the lowercase c, not the capital C conservative, which again implies a specific modern political ideology. That is not what we're talking about here. Conservative position says change, yes, but slow, controlled, measured changes that seek to account for potential consequences and circumstances invoked by that change. Last but not least, on the far right of this political spectrum are the fundamentalists. You see here on this chart, it says reactionaries. That's not quite the best word I feel that should be used to describe this. Fundamentalist is more in line with exactly what we're talking about. And these are people who advocate for no change whatsoever. They're set in their ways. They do not like nor want any change. They want things to stay exactly the way they are in perpetuity for forever, essentially. Now, closely associated with this idea of the political spectrum is what is known as the 20-60-20 rule. And this rule essentially posits that 20% of the population hold beliefs at one extreme of the political spectrum, the left per se. The other 20% hold at the right of that political spectrum. Then, of course, you have that 60% in the middle, those moderates that we talked about in the previous slide. And again, the middle can be swayed either way depending on the various social, political, economic, and other factors involved in the particular debate going on. And this rule generally applies across the board. It can change somewhat, maybe 30% on one side, 30% on 40 in the middle at times. It can fluctuate, but as a general rule, 20% are on one side, 20% are on the other side. The vast majority, that 60% or so, fall squarely in the middle and can be swayed to lean one way or the other, depending on the convincing nature of the arguments that each side invoke. Now, the next one I want to talk about is something known as the Hegelian Dialectic. Now, this is an idea that was first theorized by a famed 19th century German historian named George Hegel. Now, in the 19th century, German historians really were the ones that formulated the foundation of modern historical thought and modern historical disciplines, if you will. This idea basically posits that people tend to interpret the world in terms of opposites: black, white, cold, hot, high, low, etc., etc. Now, when two opposing ideas or positions come into contact or conflict, they eventually, over time, merge into a new idea or position that combines elements of both. You have a thesis, an antithesis or antithesis equals synthesis. Now, this synthesis then becomes the new thesis, and this whole process begins anew. This is very closely tied in with the 20-60-20 rule and the political spectrum that we just got finished speaking about. Now, this diagram over here really kind of illustrates this pretty well, I think. Again, you have the thesis, the original proposition. You have its counter proposition, the antithesis, which their arguments go back and forth on both sides of this until eventually a compromise or consensus is reached that becomes the synthesis, which is then the new thesis position. It too is then met with a counter argument, its opposite, which is its antithesis. And again, arguments go back and forth between both sides until a compromise or consensus is reached, which becomes the new synthesis, which is then the new thesis, and this whole process once again begins anew. Now, overall, what this whole thing implies is that slowly over time, the political spectrum is shifted towards the left. Now, what I mean by that is that, the thesis is often a radical or liberal position. Its antithesis is often that conservative position that we were talking about during the political spectrum discussion. Now, the synthesis of those two incorporates elements of both, which ultimately is more liberal than that original conservative position. So the new conservative position is then in opposition to an idea that is generated from the synthesis of these two original positions. So slowly over time, the conservative position is moved ever so slowly towards the left, and the whole political spectrum is shifted to where what used to be the radical or liberal position then becomes the new conservative position. And this is shifted slowly over time. This next one is one that's a little more difficult to talk about and expresses something a little more towards the dark side of human nature, if you will. It's called the Herrenvolk mentality. Essentially, Herrenvolk is a German term that simply means master race. So this is essentially the master race mentality. Keep in mind, nearly all races or ethnic groups view or have viewed themselves at some point in history as inherently better than others. Now, although in the modern idea, this is most often associated with white people or white culture. It is not specifically or only a feature of white culture. It is a feature that has manifested and expressed itself at various times, again, among nearly all races or ethnic groups. And a great example of this is represented by this image that you see right here, which was something that was distributed during the World War II era, when the Japanese were attempting to establish an empire over the Pacific region of the world. And they had these ideas that Japanese people and Japanese culture were inherently superior and more advanced, more developed, and better than these other races or ethnic groups around them. And of course, the Japanese aren't the only peoples that have had those sorts of thoughts, those sorts of ideas amongst their culture at various points. It's something that's not easy to talk about, but it is something that can be seen throughout history and must be acknowledged. Next, we have what are known as the components of war. There are three main components of war. The first is the causation of that war. What caused the tensions to get so high that conflict results? And can those potential conflicts be mitigated or avoided by some action that is taken at that point prior to open hostilities actually breaking out? Then there is the actual conflict itself, the war itself, the battles, etc., etc. Then, of course, there's the peace, the outcome of the conflict. War can be won or lost at any one of these 3 points. The peace must address the initial cause of the war. If it does not address the initial cause, it is just a recipe for future conflict and or war itself. Peace must address the rebuilding process, particularly amongst the losers of that war. The losers must retain, rebuild, restore a sense of self-image, or continued resistance will occur, which only creates more conflict. And again, at any point along that line, the war can be won or lost, even after the conflict is over, in the sense of the general social, cultural, moral, or ethical battles that undergird the actual physical confrontation that manifests in the war itself. That's it for this portion of the Elements of Historical Theory. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, do not hesitate to contact me. Study hard, and I'll see you soon.